She said, "It wasn't a lie, it was a kindness." I smiled. Good to know the rules. The next night, while believing I was working late, she learned those same rules apply to me thanks to a mutual friend's story of my date with a beautiful woman. I, 34 thought I knew my wife. I was wrong about everything. The text came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was in bed, half asleep, when my phone lit up the darkness. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my blood run cold. The person said they thought I should know something and attached 3 photos. My wife, the woman I'd been married to for 6 years, sitting in a dimly lit bar with some guy I'd never seen before. His hand on her thigh, her laughing at something he said, that specific laugh she used to reserve for me. The third photo showed them leaving together, his arm around her waist. I didn't sleep that night. I just stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through every interaction we'd had over the past few months, searching for signs I'd missed. She'd been working late more often. There were unexplained gaps in her schedule. She'd become protective of her phone, angling it away when I walked past. Small things I'd dismissed as stress from her job or just normal relationship drift. She came home around 1 a.m. I heard her trying to be quiet, easing the door shut, tiptoeing through the living room. When she slipped into bed, I pretended to be asleep. She smelled like cologne that wasn't mine, and alcohol I knew she hadn't been drinking at home. The next morning, I waited until she was showered and dressed before I brought it up. I told her I'd received some photos and asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me. The color drained from her face, then quickly returned as she composed herself. She sat down at the kitchen table and asked to see them. I showed her. She looked at each photo for a long moment, then set my phone down carefully. What she said next would replay in my mind for weeks. She told me it wasn't what it looked like, that he was just a friend from work, someone going through a rough divorce who needed support. She admitted they grabbed drinks, and maybe it looked inappropriate in the photos, but nothing happened. Nothing physical, nothing romantic. She said she hadn't told me because she knew how it would seem, and she didn't want to worry me over nothing. I asked her about his hand on her leg. She explained that he'd been emotional, thanking her for being there for him, and it was just a brief, friendly gesture that the photo made look worse than it was. I asked about them leaving together. She said she'd walked him to his Uber because he'd had too much to drink. Then came the line that would change everything. She looked at me with those eyes I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago and told me it wasn't a lie. It was a kindness. She said sometimes protecting someone you love means not telling them things that will only hurt them when there's nothing actually wrong. That her intention had been to spare me unnecessary pain over a completely innocent situation that just happened to be photographed at the worst possible moments. I sat there, absorbing this logic. This philosophy that deception could be repackaged as consideration. That hiding the truth was actually a form of love. I smiled at her. The smile must have looked genuine because she seemed to relax slightly. I told her that was good to know, that I understood the rules now. She looked confused but relieved, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. She said she was glad I understood, that she loved me, and this whole thing was just a misunderstanding. I told her I believed her. I'm not sure I did, but I said it anyway. That day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about her words, about this new framework she'd introduced into our marriage. If hiding things was kindness, if deception was love, then the rules applied both ways. I wasn't planning revenge initially. I was just angry, hurt, and looking for a way to process what felt like a fundamental betrayal of trust. By lunch, an idea had started forming. It was petty and vindictive, and I felt guilty even considering it. But the more I thought about her justification, the more it ate at me. She'd essentially given herself permission to do whatever she wanted as long as she could frame it as protecting me. I had a colleague, someone I'd known for 3 years, who'd made it clear she was interested in more than friendship. I'd always shut it down, been professional, kept appropriate boundaries. She was objectively attractive, smart, funny, and we had genuine chemistry. But I was married, and that meant something to me. Until apparently, it didn't mean the same thing to my wife. I messaged my colleague during my lunch break. I asked if she wanted to grab dinner that evening, somewhere nice, my treat. She responded within minutes, saying she'd love to. I could practically feel her excitement through the text. I went home that afternoon and told my wife I had to work late on a project that had hit some snags. She barely looked up from her laptop, just told me not to work too hard, and that she'd probably be asleep when I got home. The ease with which she accepted my lie felt like another small cut. I met my colleague at an upscale Italian place downtown, the kind with dim lighting and intimate booths. She dressed up, wearing a dark blue dress that definitely wasn't office attire. I'd worn the suit my wife always said made me look particularly good. We ordered wine, appetizers, entrees. We talked and laughed, and I found myself actually enjoying the evening, which made me feel worse and better simultaneously. About halfway through dinner, she reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She told me she'd been hoping I'd finally ask her out. I didn't move my hand away. Instead, I told her the evening wasn't exactly what she thought, but I was having a good time. She looked confused, so I explained that I was married and having some problems, and this was probably a mistake. She pulled her hand back, looking hurt and angry. She asked why I'd invited her then, if I was just going to waste her time. I apologized, said I wasn't thinking clearly, and that she deserved better than being used as some kind of revenge prop in my marital drama. But here's where it gets interesting. She thought about it for a moment, then told me she didn't care. She said she'd wanted to go out with me for years, and if my marriage was falling apart anyway, why shouldn't we enjoy the evening? She wasn't looking for a relationship or to break up my marriage. She just wanted one nice night with someone she was attracted to. I should have said no. I should have paid the bill, apologized again, and gone home. Instead, I ordered another bottle of wine. We stayed until the restaurant closed. We talked about everything except my wife and her problems. For a few hours, I forgot about the photos, the lies, the kindness defense. I just existed in a moment that felt separate from my real life. When we left, I walked her to her car. She asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, as friends. I told her maybe. She kissed me on the cheek and said the offer stood whenever I was ready. Then she drove away, and I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to figure out what I'd just done and why it didn't feel as wrong as it should have. But I hadn't accounted for one thing. We have mutual friends, my wife and I. A whole social circle that overlaps in complicated ways. And one of those mutual friends had been at the same restaurant that night with her boyfriend, celebrating their anniversary. She'd seen everything. The hand-holding, the laughter, the lingering goodbye in the parking lot. And she'd taken photos. Not maliciously, I don't think. More like documentation of something she knew would matter. I got home around midnight. My wife was still awake, sitting in the living room in the dark. I asked if everything was okay. She turned on the lamp next to the couch, and I saw her face. She'd been crying. She asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been working late, just like I said. She asked again, her voice harder this time. I repeated my answer, matching her energy. Then she held up her phone. Our mutual friend had sent her the photos with a message asking if everything was all right with us, because she'd seen me having what looked like a very romantic dinner with another woman. My wife's hands were shaking. She asked who the woman was. I told her just a colleague, someone going through some personal stuff who needed a friend. I said we'd grab dinner and talked, nothing more. The photos made it look worse than it was. She started yelling. She asked how I could do this to her, how I could lie to her face, how I could betray her trust like this. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stayed calm. I asked her what the problem was. I explained that nothing physical happened, nothing romantic. I was just being a supportive friend to someone who needed it. I hadn't told her because I knew how it would look, and I didn't want to worry her over nothing. She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. She said that was completely different, that her situation had been innocent and mine clearly wasn't. I asked her to explain the difference. She couldn't, not in any way that made logical sense. So I smiled at her, the same smile I'd given her that morning. I reminded her of what she'd told me, that it wasn't a lie, it was a kindness. That sometimes protecting someone you love means not telling them things that will only hurt them when there's nothing actually wrong. I told her I was just following the rules she'd established. The look on her face was something between rage and recognition. She realized exactly what I'd done and why. She told me I was being manipulative and cruel. I asked if she'd felt manipulative and cruel when she'd said the same things to me. She insisted it was different because she'd been telling the truth, and I was clearly lying. I asked how she knew, and pointed out that I knew with the same certainty about her situation. We argued for hours, round and round, each of us accusing the other of betrayal, dishonesty, cruelty. She demanded to know if I'd slept with my colleague. I asked if she'd slept with her coworker. Neither of us gave satisfactory answers. Finally, around 3 a.m, exhausted and hoarse, we both fell silent. She asked what we were doing. I told her I honestly didn't know anymore. She started crying again, softer this time. She admitted that maybe she'd made a mistake in how she'd handled things with her coworker, that maybe she should have been upfront with me from the beginning, and her justification had been more about protecting herself than protecting me. She said she'd been scared of my reaction, scared of conflict, and had taken the coward's way out. I appreciated the honesty, even if it came too late. I told her I hadn't slept with my colleague, which was true, but I admitted that I'd gone out with her specifically to hurt my wife, to prove a point, and that was its own form of betrayal. I said I'd been angry and wanted her to feel what I'd felt when I saw those photos. She asked if it worked. I told her I didn't know, because I felt worse now than I had before. We sat in silence for a while. Then she asked the question that had been hovering between us all night. She wanted to know if I actually believed her about her coworker, if I thought she was telling the truth about nothing happening. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her I didn't know, and maybe I never would, that the photos and the lies and the justifications had broken something fundamental in how I saw her and our relationship. Even if she was telling the complete truth, she'd introduced doubt that I couldn't unfeel. She nodded slowly, tears still rolling down her face. Then she asked if I wanted a divorce. Update 1. I didn't answer her question that night. I told her I needed time to think, and I slept in the guest room. Over the next few days, we existed in a strange limbo, polite but distant, like roommates navigating shared space. I did a lot of thinking. About trust, about marriage, about whether love could survive this kind of damage. I talked to a therapist, someone who could give me perspective without the baggage of knowing both of us. The therapist asked me what I wanted, and I realized I didn't have a clear answer. What I did know was that revenge hadn't felt as satisfying as I'd imagined. Hurting her had just created more hurt, not balanced some cosmic scale. And her admission that night, the vulnerability she'd shown in acknowledging her mistakes, had been the first real thing between us in weeks. I talked to my colleague too, apologized properly for using her. She was surprisingly understanding, told me she hoped I figured things out, and that if I ever wanted that coffee as actual friends, the offer stood. No romantic subtext, just two people who got along well. I appreciated that more than I could express. Meanwhile, my wife started being more open. She showed me text messages with her coworker, called him in front of me to establish boundaries, and explained that their friendship had caused problems in her marriage. He was apologetic, said he'd had no idea she was married and had misread their dynamic. That conversation actually helped, seeing them interact in a way that did seem genuinely platonic, even if poorly boundaried. She also admitted something else. She told me she'd been feeling disconnected from our marriage for months, maybe longer, that we'd fallen into routines that felt more like cohabitation than partnership. She'd been lonely, and the attention from her coworker had filled something she didn't realize was empty. She wasn't excusing her behavior, just explaining it. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. I'd been feeling the same disconnection, the same loneliness. We'd both been going through motions, assuming the other was fine because neither of us spoke up. After about 2 weeks of this strange détente, I told her I didn't want a divorce. But I also couldn't just pretend nothing happened and go back to how things were. If we were going to stay married, things needed to change fundamentally. She agreed. We started couples therapy. It was awkward and painful, dredging up years of unspoken resentments and unmet needs. But it was also necessary. We learned to actually communicate instead of assuming, to be vulnerable instead of defensive, to prioritize our relationship instead of taking it for granted. The therapist asked us both about the incidents, the photos, the dinner, all of it. And here's what became clear through those sessions. We'd both been wrong, just in different ways and at different times. Her initial deception had been a betrayal of trust. My revenge had been a deliberate act of cruelty. Both had caused damage. But the therapist also pointed out that we'd both, in our messy and imperfect ways, been trying to protect something. Her attempt to avoid conflict, my attempt to prove a point about double standards. Neither approach was healthy, but the underlying motivation in both cases was connected to our relationship, not separate from it. About a month into therapy, something shifted. We were in a session talking about rebuilding trust when my wife interrupted the therapist. She said she needed to tell me something, and it couldn't wait. My stomach dropped. I braced for another confession, another betrayal. Instead, she told me that going through all of this, as painful as it had been, had made her realize how much she actually loved me. That the disconnection she'd felt wasn't because she didn't care anymore, but because she'd stopped showing that she cared. She'd gotten comfortable and lazy, assuming I'd always be there without any effort on her part. The thought of losing me had terrified her in a way that cut through all the justifications and defenses. She said she wanted to fight for us, really fight, not just go through therapeutic motions. She wanted to remember why we'd chosen each other in the first place and build something better than what we'd had before. I didn't have a speech prepared in response. I just reached across the space between our chairs and took her hand. I told her I wanted the same thing. Update 2. Recovery wasn't linear. We had good days and setbacks. There were moments when one of us would say something that triggered memories of those awful few weeks, and we'd have to work through the emotions all over again. But slowly, things started to feel different. Better. We instituted date nights, actual plan time together without phones or distractions. We started talking about our days, really talking, sharing the small frustrations and victories instead of just surface-level updates. We went to bed at the same time instead of me staying up late working and her falling asleep alone. The physical intimacy took longer to rebuild. There was too much hurt, too much doubt. But eventually, that came back too. Different than before, more intentional. Less about routine and more about actual connection. About 3 months after everything imploded, we went back to that Italian restaurant. The one where I'd had dinner with my colleague. My wife suggested it, which surprised me. She said she wanted to overwrite the memory, create a new association with the place. We sat in a different booth, ordered different food. But the dim lighting and intimate atmosphere were the same. Midway through the meal, she brought up that night. She asked what I'd been thinking, what I'd hoped to accomplish. I was honest with her. I told her I'd wanted her to hurt the way I was hurting. That I'd wanted to prove that her logic was flawed, that kindness and deception couldn't coexist in the way she'd claimed. I admitted it was petty and vindictive, and I regretted the execution even if I understood my own anger. She nodded, absorbing this. Then she told me she was glad it happened. Not glad that I'd been hurt or that we'd gone through hell, but glad that everything had come to a head when it did. Because we'd been slowly dying, she said, and neither of us had noticed. We needed something to shake us awake, even if it was painful. I asked if she regretted her initial lie. She thought about it, then said yes and no. Yes, because of the damage it caused. No, because in some twisted way, it had led us to a more honest place than we'd been in years. We finished dinner and walked around downtown afterward, holding hands, talking about nothing important. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. Update 3. It's been 8 months now since the photos, the dinner, the confrontation. We're still married. Still in therapy, though less frequently. Still working on things, because that work never really stops. I think about those few weeks often. About how quickly trust can shatter and how slowly it rebuilds. About how revenge feels righteous in the moment, but hollow in retrospect. About how easy it is to justify our worst impulses when we're hurting. My wife and I are different now. We're more careful with each other, more aware of the fragility of what we have. Some people might see that as a loss of innocence or spontaneity. I see it as a deeper understanding of what marriage actually requires. She never lied to me like that again, as far as I know. And I choose to trust that she wouldn't, even though the doubt occasionally surfaces. I never used her logic against her again, never weaponized her words or actions. We both learned that keeping score in a marriage just means everyone loses. The friend who sent those initial photos apologized months later. She said she'd agonized over whether to tell me, worried about overstepping. I told her I appreciated it, even though the knowledge had been devastating. Sometimes the truth hurts worse than ignorance, but at least it gives you something solid to work with. I never went to coffee with my colleague. We remained professionally cordial, but I maintained clear boundaries. Not because I didn't trust myself, but because I respected my marriage enough not to test those limits. She moved to a different company a few months later anyway, and we lost touch. My wife still works with her coworker, but in a different capacity now. She transferred to a different department, creating natural distance. He got back together with his wife, which apparently helped clarify a lot of his boundary issues. We've never spoken, and I'm fine with that. Sometimes my wife asks if I've forgiven her. I tell her I'm working on it, which is the truth. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a process, a choice you make repeatedly. Some days are easier than others. She's never asked if I've forgiven myself for the dinner, for the intentional cruelty of it. I'm working on that too. What I've learned is that marriage isn't about never making mistakes. It's about how you handle the mistakes once they're made. Do you double down and justify? Do you lash out and escalate? Or do you sit in the discomfort, own your part, and try to do better? We chose the third option, even though it was the hardest. And our marriage survived, maybe even stronger for the breaking and rebuilding. The other night, we were lying in bed, that comfortable quiet that comes after years together. She turned to me and said she was sorry again, for everything. I told her I knew, and I was sorry too. Then she smiled, a little sad but genuine, and said she was glad we learned those rules together. That deception isn't kindness, that revenge doesn't satisfy, that trust is more valuable than pride. I smiled back and told her I was glad too. Because for all the pain, for all the mistakes, we'd found our way back to something real. Something built on honesty instead of convenience. And that, I think, is worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.